The idyllic villages that cling to our coastline. Known for their beauty and serenity.
Oh, it's wonderful to see that sailor.
Now destinations for our leisure. But once they played a vital role in our history.
This is amazing. I'm Ben Robinson, and as an archaeologist, I'm intrigued by our coastal villages because there's always a bigger story behind that idyllic postcard image.
I've come to Tintagel on Cornwall's Atlantic coast. Sat high on the cliff tops, it gets its name from the Cornish word Tintagel, meaning fortress with a narrow entrance. And legend has it that this was the birthplace of King Arthur. A popular village now, but this place was once one of England's most important ports.
Got more of an early 6th century pottery on this site than all the other sites of this period in England put together.
That's just extraordinary.
You can still find clues about how villagers lived hundreds of years ago.
The unmarried ladies, they slept up there, pulled the ladder up after themselves, and they were safe away from the men.
And I'll discover how the whole village has been shaped by the legend of King Arthur.
Some people who come to Tintagel think that that is the Camelot.
And why not?
There's a fascinating story to this village by the sea.
Approaching Tintagel from the water, I can see its legendary headland in all its glory.
I'm on the coast of North Cornwall, and out there is the wild Atlantic, the coast of France, Spain, access to the Mediterranean, North Africa. And in a landscape full of drama, the place behind me sticks out as something special, Tintagel. And up there is the remains of a medieval castle perched high on the cliff top there.
The village itself stands slightly inland, but it's been shaped and changed through the ages by one of the greatest stories of all time.
The legend of King Arthur.
Tintagel was once an important port that just after Roman times boasted prosperous trade with the Mediterranean world. The original village sat on the rocky headland, but the modern settlement developed much further inland.
I'm in Tintagel village, and it's quite clear this place has grown up to cater for that need and enthusiasm for the King Arthur myth and legend. There's the King Arthur's Arms here, there's King Arthur's Cafe, there's Celtic Legend Shop, Merlin's Cave, there's even a sword in the stone car park. In many ways, it's a little bit like a King Arthur theme park.
King Arthur is a legendary king who some believe lived in the late 5th century and early 6th century. According to the story, he led the defence of the country against the Anglo-Saxons when they invaded post-Roman Britain. The stories of Arthur's kingdom have evolved over centuries, although no one knows whether he's myth or fact.
But the key to why Tintagel and King Arthur are so closely bound together lies over there, on the headland, the site of the original village.
This place, now an island reached from the mainland by a bridge, is believed by some to be where King Arthur was born. And I'm on the lookout for evidence of an ancient settlement.
Just having a little explore here, and I'm intrigued by level areas, flat areas. There isn't too much flat ground on this rock, but where there is, you can start to see traces of unexcavated buildings. Here, it looks like a rectangular building. You see the very slight earthworks forming a sort of rectangle here. Quite hard to make out. I'll walk round the outside of what I think is a building. One wall, one end, walking round the other side, and the depression in the middle where the slightly longer grass is, that's the centre of the building. I've just noticed what looks like another one over here. And even more intriguingly, as we walk down here, and I've got to be a bit careful, I can see, you see the remains of the excavated buildings here. They're all on terraces. But if you really start to look, you can see 1, 2, 3 terraces there that haven't been fully excavated. I can see a terrace down here, another one there, another one there, another one there. I bet there are buildings under many of these. And I'm starting to get an impression that almost every square foot of this rock had buildings on it. It was clearly an amazingly significant place. Now, the archaeology is telling me that. The legend is telling me that this was where Arthur, King Arthur, was conceived and born.
Wyn Scott from English Heritage recently commissioned a dig on this site to find out more about the original village and those who lived here.
Wyn, this is a place of myth and legend, but archaeological evidence is starting to match that folklore. There was something special going on here in a very interesting period of British history.
Absolutely. It's an extraordinary site. We uncovered 3 buildings, but they're just part of a much bigger picture. We think that we've got about 100 buildings, and there's potentially more under the later castle. So we're talking, what, 1,000 people? 2,000 people possibly?
More than 1,000 years ago, that is a very, very large population.
Well, in fact, this site is bigger than anything we know for London for that period. It's a very large settlement.
People were clearly coming here in numbers, but why?
Well, there must have been some cachet, something that attracted people here. We now think that it's more likely to be an elite site, so there are kings or something like that, because we've been finding very prestigious goods. Things like pottery that's coming from the Mediterranean, from North Africa, from Greece. We've got signs of the amphorae, the big oil or wine jars. We're also seeing feasting bowls as well. And that's flooding in here in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. In large quantities. In fact, we've got more of that pottery on this site than all the other sites of this period in England put together.
That's just extraordinary.
We're also seeing beautiful glass that's coming in from France and Spain. So it's not just importing, it's not just about trade. They are consuming this stuff. They're drinking wine, they're eating out of feasting platters, they're drinking out of beautiful glasses. They're living the high life. And it's really weird that this should be happening somewhere like this in North Cornwall, but they must have been very special people.
So more of a royal centre, more of a centre of power, but essentially these are rulers of this region, this area.
Yes, how big a region we don't know, but that is now the favourite theory.
So there's actual evidence that something was going on in this very, very special village. And that must have fed the myth, the legend. Do you think Arthur actually existed and was based here?
Perhaps he did exist. It may well be at that particular time, the late 5th century, that all these exotic goods are coming in because of a figure like Arthur, or perhaps a real Arthur.
So the archaeology points to the idea that there were lords or even royalty living here as far back as the 5th century. But it was a book written several hundred years later that really inspired the legend of King Arthur. Penned by Geoffrey of Monmouth, the book identified Tintagel as the place where King Arthur was conceived. It was hugely popular and made Arthur the symbol of justice and chivalry.
Thanks to the popularity of Geoffrey of Monmouth's book, whoever owns Tintagel effectively owns the legend of King Arthur and all that that stood for. In 1233, Richard, Earl of Cornwall, brother of King Henry III no less, acquires this land and starts building a new castle on the very spot where the legend of Arthur was born. This is the castle's upper courtyard and it faces the land. So these are the landward defences. There are guard chambers, there's walls here, and it looks like a purposeful defensive structure. But down here, I'm looking down at a lower courtyard at these external walls and they're not very thick. They don't look as though they were built to withstand a siege. Catapults and trebuchets throwing down great missiles would flatten them in an instant. Now you could say you don't have to worry too much about defence. You've got the sea here. But I think something else is going on. Richard isn't worried about sieges. He's not worried about battles. He's doing something entirely different, creating a showpiece, somewhere to bring his mates and say, I'm associated with this legend, with this place.
It was the construction of this elaborate and expensive structure in the 1200s that led to the beginnings of the Tintagel village we know today.
Richard wasn't all starry-eyed about his new possession. He needed to make it work economically. So he got a charter to establish a new village. Well, in fact, a new town, a borough. And he chose a site away from the headland on this relatively flat ground. And he laid out properties alongside this wide main street. Importantly, he also got the rights to a weekly market and annual fair. Now he had the kudos of Arthur and a means to generate some serious cash. The village could expand.
Tintagel's market was a great success, and the natural harbours nearby meant that it would continue to trade. And you can still see evidence that this village was flourishing.
This is an incredible survivor from the village's medieval past. It's a hall house dating to the end of the 14th century. And you've got to imagine, back in those days, it was one long range. This building indicates how the village was growing and how aspirations were growing, because itself, it was growing and being extended. So the chimney comes much, much later. The roof was put on in the 16th century, this lovely, characterful slate roof. And it's a real reflector of how this village that Richard, Earl of Cornwall, had created was also growing at the same time. Things were changing.
This building is now owned by the National Trust and has been named after one of its many uses over the years, the old post office. Joanne McGillivray is operations manager here.
Wow, what a wonderful building you've got here. And this gives a sense of how the place was originally, open right to the roof.
This room especially, yes.
Yeah.
Back in the 14th century when it was built, everything would be happening in here. So it's quite light now with all the windows, but originally it was very tiny windows just on one wall, earth floor, a central fireplace and a thatched roof at that stage.
All the smoke drifting up, filling this space, quite a foggy sort of atmosphere. I guess I've got to imagine this open hall extending the entire length of the building originally.
That's correct, just a wooden partition between where the humans lived and the animals down the far side. Animals were slightly smaller in the 14th century, so even cows you could have had living in the house with you. You can imagine all the smells and the noises that that created, as well as all the human activity in the one room.
But actually, this was quite a high status house for the time.
Yeah, so they were quite well-to-do, the family. They owned their own land, probably could have afforded a few servants as well.
And over time, the house is growing as the village is growing, in a sense, isn't it? Or at least it's adapting.
Yes, so it's a bit like keeping up with the Joneses. So around the 1600s, they wanted to make it into a more of a fashionable townhouse. So they added the bedrooms, added the fireplaces, changed the thatch to a slate roof.
So suddenly there's a bit more privacy for family members. They've got their own bedrooms. But that up behind me there, that's not a mini minstrel's gallery, is it?
It's not, no. That was a sleeping platform. But originally it would be a ladder. You would go up there onto the shelf. And have you heard of the saying, left on the shelf? So the unmarried ladies, they slept up there, pulled the ladder up after themselves, and they were safe away from the men.
But if they stayed up there and weren't picked up, presumably they were still on the shelf.
Yeah.
I love the fact that houses like this generated sayings that we still use today.
Yes, we've got quite a few sayings around the house. So the clome oven, upper crust. A lot of the time the base would get burnt, so the servants got the burnt part of the bread, and those wealthy in the family got the nice top of the bread. This table here is linked to bed and board. The top comes away from the base, so you can eat your food on one side. You could flip it over and use it as a bed also.
Oh, that's economic living, isn't it? Not a square inch wasted. But it does strike me, just looking around, that there's a lot of evidence for ovens. So something must have happened here.
Yeah, so come the Victorian times, still had it as their home, and we think maybe at that stage there's a few different generations living here, or even different families. The fireplaces were extended and the clome ovens were put in. There's 3 in every single room downstairs.
So a house that had been quite high status in the medieval period becomes almost a series of cottages.
So it's been a shoemaker's over the years, a grocer's, a draper's, and then a letter receiving office for about 5 years in the 1870s.
That's how it's known, isn't it, famously as the old post office. But that was just a tiny part of an extraordinarily long history. It's just incredible. And when you step into places like this, you get such a sense of how people lived in old Tintagel.
The next big phase in Tintagel's development was during the Victorian era, when a massive resurgence of interest in King Arthur saw painters and writers, such as the Queen's Poet Laureate Alfred Lord Tennyson, embrace the legends in their works. And this meant that Tintagel underwent an epic rebuilding project, all designed to bring wealthy tourists and investment to the village.
There's no better expression of the transformation of this village than this, King Arthur's great halls. Look at those stone mullioned windows, the big bay windows on the ground floor, and this porch with its Gothic arches. It looks like the entrance to a castle or a manor. Now, this may be Victorian and Edwardian, but it harks back to an earlier era, the medieval period.
British historian and writer Dr. Onyeka Nubia has studied the Victorians' renewed interest in this ancient myth.
What a spectacular building this is. Absolutely incredible. I mean, a very nice Victorian house on the front, but at the back here, this huge great hall. Wooden barrel-vaulted ceilings, stained glass, Cornish granite everywhere. The craftsmanship, the expense of it all.
The question is, Ben, how much of what we see here relates to those 6th century Arthurian legends, and how much of it is a Victorian or an Edwardian imagination? Because King Arthur originally was a Celtic warrior, a warrior from the fens or a warrior from the wilderness who becomes a king. He was not the British iconic figure that we now know.
And the emphasis of this story and the messages that it's giving us changed.
What these Victorian writers like Alfred Lord Tennyson do is sort of reimagine King Arthur so that it supports notions of Britishness and British identity. King Arthur becomes a sort of Victorian prince, and the idea is that you focus on concepts of chivalry. You focus on ideas of courtly romance and courtly love. We get an Arthur that represents ideals and values that some people felt was under threat and under pressure. And the stained glass windows that we see, they are Victorian imagining of that period in time.
The Victorian idea of how a gentleman should behave was based on this romantic version of Arthur, and they took it one step further.
Then Arthur becomes the legendary champion of Christianity, driving out the pagans. He becomes a nationalistic figure that can be owned by all of Britain. And that sort of fits where Britain is at that moment in time as an imperial nation.
You've got to create the Arthur that works for you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they did that.
And I love that the history and the myths and the legends are actually shaping the village throughout time as well. The village is shaping the mythology, but the mythology is also shaping the village.
The arrival of the railway to nearby Camelford in 1893 cut journey times from London from around a week to a day, which meant more and more people flocked to Tintagel to get their Arthurian fix. And so buildings and the villagers adapted to cater for their ever-growing needs.
Look at this lovely old building here with that great slate roof, really characterful. It's been converted into tea rooms now, but cottages like this would have lined this main street here. And the people who lived in the cottages would have offered the growing number of visitors cream teas, perhaps overnight accommodation. But as the tourist boom really started to take off, visitors demanded something more. So Victorian and Edwardian speculators built buildings such as this. Look at the entrance porch here with its colonnades, clearly lots of rooms. This was a better class of accommodation for the tourists that were starting to flood in. And as I look around, I can see more hotels here, guest houses, another one down there. In fact, much of old Tintagel was swept away in this frenzy to build accommodation and eateries for visitors.
And what is perhaps the pinnacle of the Victorians' love of Arthur can be seen at one end of the village looking out to sea, and it shares its name with his legendary castle.
Well, I've finally made it to Camelot, home of the Knights of the Round Table. Well, in Victorian hotel form at least. And there's no doubting the inspiration behind this place. Look at the battlements, the turrets, look at the shields. And for a small village to have something like this is quite extraordinary. It just shows how important Tintagel was becoming as a must-see Victorian destination.
Parish Council Chairman Roger Lyle has family connections to this hotel going back 3 generations.
Roger, some people who come to Tintagel think that that is the King Arthur's castle.
And why not? I mean, it's a perfect example of what people expect a castle to look like.
It is extraordinary. I mean, all those wonderful windows giving these views over towards the island.
Yep, 365 windows and around about 100 rooms.
This is a huge hotel for a little place and in quite a remote spot. It was quite controversial when it was built, wasn't it?
Yeah, built in 1899. Originally, the plans were for down there on Barras Head, but the local people said, no, we're not having that. So they clubbed together and bought the headland, and they actually gave it to what was then the National Trust Company.
And you've got a personal connection to this building. It's not just a landmark, it's not just a hotel, but you had family that worked here.
Yes, on both parents' sides. My grandfather was shoe boy here, and he would have to go and clean everyone's shoes before they got up for breakfast. My grandmother was one of the waiting staff come housemaids. And on my father's side, his aunt, my great aunt, wanted to buy this hotel and eventually raised enough money. And she went off to London and bought it at auction as a young, I think she was 21.
Crikey, well, what a thing to take on at that age.
She spent most of her time in the office counting money.
Yeah, because it was a particular kind of tourist that came. It was someone that had means.
Oh, it's certainly the well-to-do. In fact, some of my friends, their great-grandparents used to go with their horses and carriages to Camelford Station and pick up the London gentry to bring to the King Arthur's Castle Hotel. Their servants would come down some time before and they would stay up in the village in boarding houses. And they would stay here for up to 3 months, taking in the air, sitting on the terrace, just taking in the views, lovely. They would also sort of be taken down to bathe in the mineral-rich waters, just recuperating from the stresses of city life.
And of course, immerse themselves in the legend of King Arthur.
Yes, definitely.
More than 100 years on, people are still flooding in. They still want to stay in this spectacular location and drink in all this history. How does it feel, as someone who's lived here all your life, to share Tintagel with people from all over the world?
Well, it's an honour, isn't it? Why not share this beautiful bit of Cornwall? It is the best view in the world.
Tintagel is a magical place. It's a legendary place. It's somewhere where myth and fantasy come together with history and archaeology to tell compelling, intoxicating stories. And people come from all over the world to investigate for themselves the age of Arthur, real or imagined. And they'll continue to come because the future will always need the romance and inspiration of the past.